I remember Dad's laugh before I remember the crash. He had that booming, open-hearted chuckle that echoed off the gum trees whenever he told one of his ridiculous bush camping stories. He always wore that blue jacket, an old windbreaker patched at the elbows, faded from sun and smeared with grease from fixing his old Holden ute. When Mum told me the plane went down somewhere in the snowy mountains, I refused to believe it. A bush pilot, my father, too sure-footed, too steady-handed to be swept away by some rogue downdraft. It was the morning of 14th of July 1931, but at home it felt like the world stopped on the day the southern cloud vanished. Word had come at dawn, radio silence, no wreckage, no survivors, just endless white peaks that swallowed any trace of the tiny Avro 618 spirit of progress. Weeks turned into months, and rumors trickled in. Distress signals, broken wing struts spotted by shepherds, even glimpses of a ragged jacket hanging off a branch. But no proof, no bodies, no answers. Decades later, when we reopened Dad's old mountain trail to retrace the search party's footsteps, curiosity gnawed at me. I needed to feel close to him again, so I hiked with nothing but a knapsack, a flask of tea, and an old photograph of his blue jacket. The trail wound through ancient snow gums and rocky gullies, the wind carrying whispers of that lost flight. At first light, I stepped around a bend and froze. There, folded neatly atop a flat slab of granite, lay that same blue jacket. No sign of wear, no bloodstains, just the faint smell of petrol and pine needles. I sat down on the frigid stone, heart hammering. The jacket's elbows still bore Mum's handiwork, her careful stitching bright against the faded cloth. Inside a breast pocket, I found a half-charred notebook. Its pages crackled under my fingertips, Dad's handwriting, looping and sure, describing the last moments before the engine sputtered and died. He'd sketched the jagged ridge ahead, scrawled coordinates, signs of an emergency landing in the high country. I traced each line with a trembling finger, his voice rushing into my mind. He wrote about the fall of night, how they'd prepared to hike for help at first light, how he'd promised the radio operator at Bathurst he'd be home by dinner. His last entry ended abruptly. "If anyone finds this," and then 2 words scratched out, replaced by, "Tell Anna I held on." Mum's name and the weight of hope and despair tethered together in one sentence. The silence of the mountains pressed in as I closed the notebook. I thought I'd come here seeking closure, but in that moment, I realized the story was far from over. Dad's final journey wasn't just about survival. It was about the bond between 2 people who refused to let go. With renewed purpose, I rolled up the jacket, placed it reverently in my pack, and stood up. The sun had climbed. The day demanded I follow in their footsteps. And so, beneath the looming ridges of the snowy mountains, I took my first steps down the trail, ready to uncover the truth of what really happened. Ready to bring my father home. Dawn's first light seeped through the narrow canyon, painting the snow gums in ghostly silver. The air was so thin I could feel each heartbeat in my temples. Clutching Dad's faded blue jacket to my chest, I pressed on along the ridge where his cursive coordinates had led me. Every crunch of my boots against frost-hardened gravel sounded like a muted drumbeat, guiding me deeper into the labyrinthine high country. I paused at a rocky alcove where the wind whistled through a natural archway of stone. Here, Dad had drawn a crude sketch of a makeshift campsite, 3 cairns stacked like prayer stones, a smear of oil on a flat boulder, and the broken tip of what might have been a propeller blade half buried in snow. My breath caught as I knelt to clear the snow with trembling fingers. Sure enough, shards of metal glinted beneath. I gingerly extracted a curved fragment, its rivets still visible. Hands shaking, I traced the serial numbers stamped faintly along the edge, matching them to the Spirit of Progress's manufacturing log I'd photocopied before leaving home. It was undeniably part of his plane. Memories flooded back, unbidden. I saw Dad's broad shoulders bending over the Avro that morning, his hands steady as he tightened a bolt, his voice calling, "Pack light, kiddo, but take enough for a week." I remembered how his brown eyes had crinkled with that same gentle confidence he always wore under that blue jacket. A sudden gust sent a spray of marble-size hail across the ridge, jolting me from nostalgia. The mountains, I realized, were as unforgiving as they were beautiful. I pressed on, following the cairns he'd marked, navigating narrow ledges that dropped into yawning chasms. The journal pages hinted at his dwindling supplies: half a tin of biscuits, a broken compass, the last sip of lukewarm tea. On the fourth page, he'd scrawled a desperate plea for help. If I can reach that outcrop by sunset, I might signal the search party with the mirror. As I climbed toward the jagged promontory he'd drawn, the sky shifted from pale blue to angry slate. Dark clouds massed overhead, and the wind carried the promise of a sudden storm. I found the outcrop as the storm broke. Sheets of hail spattered against my parka, and visibility dropped to a few meters. Heart pounding, I sheltered against the cold stone, prying open Dad's journal to the relevant entry. "Storm moving in fast. I'll wait here. Mirror ready. Hope they're looking." My fingers froze as I turned back to the precipice. There, half hidden beneath a slick of ice, was a small, hexagonal glass mirror, the same one he'd described, the same that once flashed sunlight across the runway at Bathurst Aerodrome. Its metal frame was corroded, the glass cracked but still reflective. With gloved hands, I lifted the mirror and angled it toward the waning sun. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then beyond the curtain of hail, a faint, bright flicker repeated, an echo of his signal, a shimmer of hope frozen in time. I closed my eyes and let the significance wash over me. Two souls separated by decades, connected by the same desperate act. My voice caught as I whispered, "Dad, I'm here." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind an eerie calm. Patches of blue sky re-emerged, and the world felt suspended between past and present. I tucked the mirror into my pack alongside the propeller fragment and the jacket, feeling the weight of each relic as both blessing and burden. Ahead, the ridge descended into a hidden valley dotted with ancient alpine ash, exactly where his last sketch had pointed. I took a steadying breath and began the descent. Loose stones shifted underfoot, and the air grew thick with the scent of moss and wet earth. Somewhere below, a trickle of meltwater ran over smooth rock, its gentle murmur promising fresh water. For him, for me. I imagined Dad crouched beside that stream, cupping the crystalline flow in his hands, drawing strength from its cold clarity. By late afternoon, the valley floor stretched out before me, bathed in golden light. I paused at the edge and unfolded a detailed map I'd taped into my journal. It showed a cluster of fallen pines, marking the spot where he'd written, "Shelter among the dead forest." I crossed my heart and continued, each step echoing his long-ago journey. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, I reached the grove of shattered trunks. Silhouetted against the sky, the skeletal trees stood like silent sentinels. Among them lay another piece of the wreck. Strips of fabric from the fuselage, still sewn to splintered wood. I knelt and traced its frayed edges, tears stinging my eyes. The forest felt sacred, a shrine to his courage and his final stand against the elements. Night fell cold and clear. I set up camp on a flat patch of ground, wrapping Dad's jacket around my shoulders. Over a simple meal, I read the next entry in his notebook, the one I hadn't dared to open until now. His words were calm, almost serene. "I'm tired, but not afraid. The mountains taught me this. When you're lost, you find yourself. If I fall knowing I loved every breath of this wild land." Under a canopy of stars, I closed the journal and stared into the darkness. His journey had begun here, and mine was only just unfolding. The valley's hush settled over me like a soft blanket, broken only by the distant drip of meltwater. Dawn had not yet touched the sky when I awakened, the cold seeping through my thin ground sheet. I buried my hands deeper into Dad's blue jacket, its fabric still stiff with frost, and watched my breath curl into the air. The journal lay open beside me, waiting. I hesitated before reading on, as if afraid its next entry might shatter the fragile connection I'd rediscovered. When I finally forced my eyes over the looping lines, the words felt heavier than before. Dad described waking to a sharp snap of wood, perhaps a tree limb giving way in the night, and spotting something glinting beneath a thick sheet of ice that had formed overnight. His entry sketched a triangle of broken ice on the hillside above the grove, where he'd found a cache of supplies he'd stashed in case search parties had arrived and left offerings. A tin of condensed milk, a flannel shirt, and a half-empty jar of jam. He'd chalked on the rock beside it a plea: "Here lie gifts for those who come looking. Please do not pass by." I rose, shoving aside the remains of my campfire, and shouldered my pack. Above me the pines rattled in a slight breeze, as though whispering encouragement. The morning air smelled of wet earth and resin. I followed the fallen stream uphill, stepping carefully on stones glazed with ice. The slope grew steeper, and I used carved footprints, his footprints, to guide me, the sharp gouges still visible in the sodden ground. Halfway up the rise, I came upon a patch of cracked ice, glimmering opalescent in the half-light. Kneeling, I brushed away the loose fragments with gloved fingertips. Beneath, I saw the glint of metal. Dad's mirror, long thought corroded, now perfectly preserved by the ice's crystal embrace. My pulse thundered as I pried it free and wiped the surface with my sleeve. For a heartbeat, I saw only my own reflection, bleary and ghostly. Then, behind me in the ice's depth, I thought I saw his wide grin. Shaking, I pocketed the mirror and continued, cresting the ridge as the sunrise poured gold across the valley. On a flat ledge, just where his sketch indicated, lay the supply cache. The jam's glass jar was cracked but intact. The condensed milk tin bulged as if frozen and swollen. A flannel shirt, faded but clean, lay folded atop a rock. I picked it up, noting the faint scent of tobacco and pine. Dad's familiar cologne mixed with the bushland's perfume. Beneath the shirt, scratched into the rock, were more coordinates and a plea. "If no one follows, I go alone. Tell Anna I'm waiting." Beneath that, 2 words: "Forgive me." My throat constricted. I sank to the ledge's edge, the valley unfolding below in a tapestry of emerald moss and silver streams. How far could he have gone alone? How many nights had he crossed peaks I could barely glimpse now? I refolded the flannel and slipped it into my pack beside the journal. Above me, a solitary wedge-tailed eagle spiraled on thermals, its wingspan as vast as the void in my heart. I stared until the bird drifted out of sight, letting its freedom echo in my mind. The next entry in the journal was dated 5 days after the crash. He wrote of crossing a narrow saddle under a full moon, guided by the glow of his watch's luminous dial. He described glimpsing lights, maybe smoke signals, from a hut deep in the highlands. Exhausted but driven by hope, he determined to reach those lights before his supplies ran out. That night, he had drawn a rudimentary map of ridges and cairns leading to the shelter, 3 stone circles around a collapsed hut. I folded the journal and pressed on, retracing his final route. The air grew thinner and colder as I climbed. My legs burned, but I pushed through the ache, spurred by the thought of finding that hut. Around noon, I reached the saddle depicted in his sketch. A bright sun hung in a cloudless sky, and the ice underfoot threatened to betray each step. I planted my ice axe and crept forward. There, nestled against a rock outcrop, stood the remains of the hut. Only 2 stone circles remained. Timber had rotted away, leaving only rusted nails and fragments of corrugated iron. Inside, I found the last of Dad's belongings: a battered tin cup, its rim bent, a half-burned matchbox, and tucked under a stone, a leather pouch with his initials. Inside the pouch lay a photograph of Mum and me, smiling outside the cottage at Orange. Tears blurred my vision as I cradled the picture to my heart. His final entry ended in mid-sentence. I've made it this far. If I'm to leave this world, let it be knowing I... The rest of the page was blank, ink smeared by moisture long ago. I pressed my palm to the empty space. imagining his pen stalling as he paused, uncertain what words could capture the moment. The wind howled through the remains of the hut, rattling the iron scraps like skeletal fingers. I wrapped the blue jacket around my shoulders again, its warmth a reminder of his presence. I stood and surveyed the ridges that stretched into the distance, each a question mark leading back to that lonely saddle. Somewhere along one of those slopes, Dad's journey had ended. I set up camp inside the stone circle, sheltering from the wind. As twilight fell, I lit a small fire and arranged his belongings before me. The mirror, the propeller fragment, the jam jar, the photograph, and the pouch. One by one, I held each relic up to the firelight, watching shadows dance on the stones. It felt as if I'd convened a silent vigil, a communion across time. Under the flickering glow, I made a promise. I would follow his path to the very end. Whether the trail led to hope or tragedy, his story would be told. I'd carry these mementos down the mountain, each a testament to his courage and love. Night closed around me, the stars blazing with ancient light. I lay back against the stones, the blue jacket cradling me like an embrace. In the stillness, I heard distant whispers, echoes of his voice carried on the wind. "Anna, wait." First light broke pale over the saddle, turning the frost-encrusted stones to diamonds. I packed my camp swiftly, the weight of Dad's blue jacket on my shoulders a reassuring anchor. Ahead lay a gently descending slope, blanketed in fresh snow. The perfect canvas Dad had written for leaving tracks that might guide searchers. As I stepped onto the white expanse, I paused. My own footprints stretched behind me, and I realized I could trace his path by searching for overlapping prints. His original, now obscured by decades of wind, and the faint impressions of boots made half a century ago. I followed the line of deep, uneven prints that led toward a narrowing ravine. The ravine's entrance was choked with snowdrifts and the collapsed bones of ancient trees. I crouched to examine the prints. The heel of each boot pressed deeper than the ball, suggesting someone exhausted, leaning forward with determination. The spacing grew irregular, as if the traveler had paused often, perhaps to rest, to look for a way out, or simply to catch his breath. I dropped onto my knees and ran my gloved hand along one edge of a print, finding the rough weave of canvas, similar to the fabric patching on Dad's jacket. My heart leapt. Carefully, I dug around the print and uncovered a small leather-bound compass, its glass face cracked but the needle still quivering northward. I slipped it into my pocket as proof of his presence here. Pressing on through the ravine, the walls closed in, cliffs of ice and stone rising on either side. The air smelled of damp earth and melting snow. Each echo of my footsteps reverberated, making me feel watched by unseen eyes. About halfway in, I spotted another relic, a length of braided rope caught on a jagged rock. The fibers were stiff, frozen solid, but unmistakably coated in engine oil, his makeshift tow line he'd planned to drag debris to clear a path. My breath caught as I realized how meticulously he'd prepared. The journal hadn't mentioned the rope, yet here it was, lying exactly as he'd left it. I closed my eyes and imagined him hauling the rope, inching through the ravine, driven by hope and fear in equal measure. At the ravine's end, the landscape opened into a frozen creek bed. I followed the winding channel, looking for fresh water. Near a bend, I found a flattened tin cup embedded in ice, a companion to the tin cup I'd already recovered. Someone had been here, drinking deeply at the creek, trying to stay alive. Breaking through the ice with the toe of my boot, I filled my canteen and drank, the cold water startling but invigorating. I could almost feel Dad's strength flowing through me. I filled the rest of my bottles to carry on. The opposite bank rose to a plateau where a single snow gum stood resolute against the sky. Its gnarled roots clawed at the rock. Beneath it, I discovered more evidence. The charred remains of a small fire, a scattering of matchsticks, and a scrap of paper pinned beneath a stone. Carefully, I pried it loose and read Dad's neat script. Tomorrow I head east toward the road. It's my last chance. Eastward lay the Dead Horse Road, a rough track used by drovers long before the crash, now little more than a memory on maps. It represented civilization, rescue, home. I traced the direction on my map and set off across the plateau, every step a tribute to his final push. By dusk, I reached a fork marked on his sketch. One path wound along the cliff edge, the other dipped into a gully choked with frost-withered ferns. He'd chosen the gully. I tested each route, the cliff path too narrow and exposed, the gully offering sheltered footing. I plunged into the ferns, the light fading to blue twilight. Ahead, I heard the faint echo of metal against metal, like the ringing of a bell. Curious, I pushed aside the ferns and uncovered a bent bicycle bell, its inner mechanism rusted, but its tone still clear in memory. Dad must have carried it, something to signal his approach if he heard searchers. I pressed the clapper against the rim. It emitted a soft, hollow ring that seemed to summon the valley to attention. Night fell as I emerged from the gully onto the faint tire tracks of the old road. I set up camp beside the depressed rut, placing the bicycle bell and compass beside me. Drawing Dad's jacket tight around my waist, I made a small fire and wrote in my own journal, "I've reached the Dead Horse Road, Dad. Tomorrow I follow your final footsteps to find where you waited and where you hoped to be found." The wind carried the scent of eucalyptus across the clearing. Above me, Orion tracked his nightly journey across the sky. I closed my eyes and listened for echoes, footsteps, a distant bell, the reassuring sound of a plane's engine. Tomorrow, I would finish what he began. First light of dawn revealed the pale ribbon of the Dead Horse Road, winding through the high plains like an ancient serpent. Clutching Dad's blue jacket tightly around my shoulders, I stepped onto the worn rut, each footfall echoing against the hollow earth. The road was little more than two parallel tracks, half eroded by winter melt and constrained by tufts of alpine grass. Yet to me, it felt like the most solid link between past and present, between his final hopes and my desperate determination to honor them. As I walked eastward, the landscape unfolded in muted tones of grey and ochre. Fields of tussock grass swayed in the morning breeze, and distant peaks, some still topped with lingering snow, caught the sun's first rays like glimmering chimneys of an iceberg. I paused often to scan either side of the road, knowing that Dad had veered from this path only once, at a small creek crossing marked on his sketch. According to the journal, he paused there to rest and refill his water, leaving behind small cairns as directional beacons. About an hour into my trek, I found those cairns, 3 stacks of flat stones glazed with morning frost. Beneath the third stack lay a rusted bolt from the Avro's engine cowling. The metal was lacquered by time, but the distinct threading matched the engine logs I'd studied back home. I pocketed it alongside the bicycle bell and compass, my pack growing heavier with each relic. Yet their weight grounded me, each piece a tangible proof of his journey and a marker guiding me toward the truth. Further along, the road dipped into a shallow valley where the soil ran dark with moisture. Here, Dad had noted that he'd paused at midday to escape the punishing glare of the sun and munch on his last rations of dried meat and stale biscuits. I settled on a flat rock beneath a solitary snow gum whose gnarled branches bore the scars of decades. Opening my pack, I retrieved a tin of condensed milk I'd found in the high ridge, sharing half of its contents with a pair of inquisitive crimson rosella's cockatoos that hopped nearby. Their bright plumage contrasted sharply with the muted landscape, and for a moment I felt his spirit in the gentle way they cocked their heads at me. I continued, descending into a deeper valley scented with eucalyptus. The journal entry described how the bush canopy had offered him shelter from a sudden hailstorm that battered his shoulders, driving him off the road into the undergrowth. As I rounded a bend, I encountered the remnants of that shelter. Crushed ferns flattened by impact, the battered tin cup half buried beside a broken branch. I scanned the sky, blue now with roving clouds, and thanked Dad silently for his care, his journal having saved me from walking blind into danger. By late afternoon, the road climbed steeply toward a low saddle marking the boundary of the search area. Dad's final sketch had pinpointed this saddle as the place where he'd paused to wave frantically at a passing aircraft, one of the early commercial flights that sometimes graced these skies. My heart pounded as I scaled the last rise. There, etched into a sun-bleached boulder, were the fading outlines of a handprint and the words, "Help me." Beneath, scratched in smaller letters, "Anna." I knelt and traced the letters with a gloved fingertip, tears stinging my eyes. The world felt suspended, the quiet hum of cicadas, the distant cry of a wedge-tailed eagle, and the steady beat of my own heart. I placed the blue jacket at the base of the boulder, smoothing it out as if draping it over his name. Then I pressed the compass and bicycle bell against the rock and stood back, stepping off the saddle to glimpse the plains beyond, endless expanses of gold and green stretching toward Bathurst and home. As the sun sank low, casting long shadows across the land, I lit a small fire beside the boulder. The jacket warmed around my shoulders, and I read the final journal entry aloud. "If no plane comes tomorrow, I'll walk on until help finds me." I carry my love for Anna in every step. I folded the journal and buried it beneath a cairn beside Dad's boulder, alongside the propeller fragment and jam jar, so that future searchers might find our story. Then, wrapping the blue jacket around my shoulders like a cloak of memory, I settled down beside the fire and stared into the darkening sky. Tomorrow, I would leave the high country behind and return to where his journey had begun, Bathurst Aerodrome, carrying his legacy, his courage, and his love. The morning sun broke through a veil of silvery mist as I packed away the ashes of last night's fire. The blue jacket felt heavier than ever, its weight a testament to the emotional burden I carried, my father's final words etched into every fiber. I traced my fingers over the faded stitching at the elbows, remembering Mum's careful handiwork, and took a deep breath. Below me lay the long descent toward Bathurst, where asphalt runways and radio towers stood in stark contrast to the wild high country I'd called home for the past week. The trail off the saddle was steep and loose, a mix of shale and limestone scree that shifted underfoot. I moved slowly, planting each foot deliberately, eyes glued to the path ahead. Halfway down, the valley opened to reveal a tumbling creek, its gurgling waters clear and cold. Dad had mentioned this stream in his journal as the place where he'd quenched his last thirst before sighting the aerodrome's lights. I knelt at the bank, filled my flask, and paused to swallow the icy water. It tasted of promise, of civilization, and the end of a long journey. On the opposite bank, half buried in moss and mud, I spotted a battered metal signpost. Its paint was flaked off by sun and storm, but I could just make out the faint letters, "To Aerodrome." My heart surged as I crossed the creek and brushed away lichen to reveal the sign's full inscription. It pointed eastward along a barely visible track that cut through a stand of ghostly snow gums. I followed the sign's direction, stepping over fallen branches and through tufts of bracken that clawed at my ankles. The scrub grew denser, the sunlight dimmer, until I emerged onto a gravel road, the very access road that service vehicles used to reach the old Bathurst Aerodrome. My boots crunched against the gravel, and I felt buoyed by hope. Somewhere ahead, the hangars awaited, and perhaps the answers my father had waited so long to give. After an hour of walking, the roar of engines reached my ears, small piston planes taking off and landing in the distance. The sound reverberated through my chest, matching the beat of my heart. I quickened my pace, skirting around a fence and stepping onto the tarmac where a weatherly agricultural aircraft taxied past, spraying fertilizer on distant fields. The pilot waved as he passed. I lifted Dad's blue jacket and waved it in return, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. The main hangar stood ahead, a weathered corrugated iron building with Bathurst Aero Club painted in peeling letters above its sliding doors. I hesitated at the threshold, gathering my courage, then walked inside. The hangar was filled with the smell of oil, paint thinner, and the faint tang of avgas. Mechanics crouched over light aircraft, and pilots in leather jackets chatted near the coffee urn. All eyes turned to me as I stepped forward, the jacket draped over my arm like a flag of surrender and triumph. "Can I help you?" asked a burly man in coveralls, wiping his hands on a rag. I showed him the jacket, then the compass, the photograph, and finally, the journal. His eyes widened and the hangar fell silent. "This belonged to Captain Thomas Redmond," I explained, voice catching. "My father. He disappeared in 1931. I've retraced his footsteps and brought these back." A hush settled as the mechanics and pilots gathered around. One older man, his hair silver, his shoulders broad, stepped forward. "I'm Peter Callahan," he said quietly. "I've heard the legend of the pilot who vanished in the snowy mountains. Your father was the first to fly the Spirit of Progress on that route." He paused, eyes glistening. "Where did you find these?" I told them the story. The mountain trail, the ridge, the hut, the ravine, the dead horse road, and finally this very tarmac. With each sentence, I felt my father's presence grow stronger in the room, binding me to every listener. When I finished, Peter nodded slowly and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've given him back to us," he said. "And to yourself." He gestured to a small display case in the corner of the hangar, where aged artifacts and black and white photographs chronicled the Aero Club's history. "Let's put these here with the others, so no one forgets." We gathered around as he carefully placed the blue jacket on a padded form, the compass on a velvet cushion, and the photograph beside a plaque bearing Thomas Redmond's name. The workshop lights cast a warm glow over the mementos, making the jacket's color, once faded by sun and snow, seem to reclaim its original cobalt brilliance. Silence reigned, broken only by the distant thrum of a radial engine. As I stepped back, I realized I was smiling through tears. The closure I'd sought for so long had finally come, not in discovering my father's body, but in reuniting his story with the living world. Before I left, Peter placed a hand on the journal. "This belongs in the club's archives," he said. "Future generations will read your father's own words." I nodded, handing it to him. Then I turned to the man I'd become, no longer a lost daughter searching mountain ridges, but a storyteller bearing witness to courage, love, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Stepping out onto the tarmac, I felt the sun's warmth on my face and the roar of distant wings overhead. I lifted my gaze to the vast Australian sky, blue as the jacket at my side, and whispered, "Thank you, Dad." The scent of old paper and polished wood greeted me as I stepped into the Bathurst Aero Club's tiny archival room. Peter Callahan had insisted I accompany him to the back, where dusty binders and faded logbooks lined shelves that reached the ceiling. A single lamp cast a golden cone of light over a sturdy oak table, where he'd laid out Dad's journal, the warped tin cup, and the battered compass. I traced the journal's cover with reverent fingers. It was stained with mountain rain and creased from wind-blown nights. Peter opened a ledger from 1931, its yellowed pages listing every flight that had passed through Bathurst Aerodrome during those early years of aviation. With his finger, he followed the entry for 14th of July. Avro 618, Captain T. Redmond, departing for Canberra, ETA 1500. Below that, a terse notation. No further communication, followed by a blank space. I swallowed hard as he closed the ledger. "We never updated it," he said quietly, eyes misting. "We assumed the worst when the search yielded nothing." His voice cracked. "Thank you for bringing him home." He pulled open a second drawer and produced a ledger of search operations. Bound in worn leather, it contained detailed reports from volunteers and Air Force detachments combing the snowy mountains. Eyewitness sketches, telegram transcripts, ration distributions. They documented every lead, no matter how faint. We pored over pencil maps scribbled by desperate hands, marking creeks and ridges. In one margin, someone had doodled a crude drawing of a blue jacket hanging from a branch. Night had fallen outside, But in the archive room, time felt suspended. I ran my hand over Dad's faded, penciled coordinates in the journal and then over the search ledger's notes. It struck me that his own words had stealthily guided me through decades of dead ends, rescuing him at last from obscurity. Peter closed the ledger and looked up. "I want these preserved," he said, gesturing to the artifacts. "Your father's story needs to live on." He tapped the journal's cover. "We'll digitize it, transcribe every page, and display excerpts alongside the items in the hangar's new exhibit." I nodded, overwhelmed by gratitude. To know that Dad's final days would inspire future aviators felt like a gift. The closure I'd sought had blossomed into a legacy. Before I left the archive, I asked Peter one last question. "Is there any record of what happened to the search plane that first spotted wreckage near the snowy mountains?" He paused, then retrieved a small folder labeled Operations 1931. Inside was a photograph of a DH-83 Fox moth, its wings trimmed in red, perched on a makeshift airstrip carved into a high plateau. The caption read, "Rescue Flight, Lieutenant Harris, August 1931, no survivors found." I studied the photo. The Fox moth resembled the planes I'd flown as a teenager, its open cockpit and wooden propellers evoking a bygone era. I felt a pang of sorrow for the rescue crews who poured their hearts into a mission that found only echoes and artifacts. But their courage had paved the way for mine. Tucking the photograph into my pack, I stepped back into the hangar's warmth. Mechanics were shutting down for the night, their laughter echoing faintly from the main bay. Outside, a soft rain had begun to fall, the droplets pattering against corrugated iron like a lullaby. I pulled Dad's jacket tighter, its damp fabric warming against my chest. As I walked to my car, I replayed the week's journey, discovering the folded jacket on the mountain slab, unearthing the mirror beneath ice, tracing footprints in fresh snow, and finally setting foot on the tarmac where his memory breathed again. Each relic had spoken to me in its own way, telling me that his spirit had never truly left those mountains. Back at my motel, I laid out the artifacts on the bed, each piece a chapter of his final narrative. The compass pointed true north, unchanged by time. The tin cup still bore the smudge of campfire soot. The photograph of Mum, taken decades before my birth, captured a moment of joy that transcended loss. I placed the journal open on the bedside table, and in the margin of the last blank page wrote my own entry. "Dad, I found you, not just in these mountains, but in every ripple of ice, every gust of wind, every echo of your laughter. I carry your story now, and I will tell it well." I sat on the edge of the bed, the rain's soft rhythm lulling me towards sleep. Outside, the world felt smaller, no longer an expanse filled with unanswered questions, but a tapestry rich with memory and love. And as I drifted off, I knew the final chapters of our shared journey were still to be written, together, across time and space. The next morning, a thin mist clung to the air as I packed my bag for the final leg of my journey. The artifacts I'd gathered, Dad's compass, the bicycle bell, the tin cup, were now carefully wrapped and stowed in my pack alongside his journal. Yet it was the blue jacket that weighed heaviest on my shoulders, its fabric saturated with memories and unanswered questions. Today I would return to the very place where he'd last touched solid ground, Bathurst itself. Descending from the high country, I retraced the road that wound through rolling pastures dotted with grazing sheep. The world below felt unchanging, serene, yet I carried the knowledge of the mountain's hidden trials. Cows watched curiously as I passed, and the gentle crunch of gravel under my boots reminded me that life continued, even as history lay buried beneath snow and ice. By late morning, I reached the outskirts of Bathurst, the town's red brick buildings rising against a backdrop of eucalyptus-covered hills. The Bathurst Aero Club's hangar stood just beyond the last houses, its silhouette familiar after the emotional reunion inside. I paused at the gate, adjusting the blue jacket around my shoulders. It felt strange to stand here in daylight, where only weeks ago my footsteps had been guided by candlelit journal pages and gleaming artifacts. I made my way through town to the old post office on Keppel Street. My grandmother had kept every letter Dad had written during his service in World War I and his subsequent flights across Australia. Town law said those letters were locked in a drawer at the Historical Society, untouched for decades. If I could find them, I might read his own words to Mum, uncovering emotions he hadn't dared record on that final journal page. Inside the Historical Society building, the air smelled of linseed oil and parchment. A friendly archivist named Margaret led me to a display cabinet where Dad's letters lay under glass. Each envelope bore his elegant scrawl and the fading postmarks of military mail, Cairo, London, Sydney, and finally Bathurst. With white cotton gloves, she handed me the letters one by one. I found a worn envelope addressed simply Anna Redmond Orange, Ensidals, Mum's maiden name. My hands trembled as I slid the letter free and unfolded the brittle paper. His words leapt off the page in precise, looping script. My dearest Anna, the desert winds have taught me patience and silence. Each night I look to the Southern Cross and think of your smile. I carry your laughter with me as the planes carry their loads, steady, unwavering. Tears welled as I read on. His letters spoke of longing, of the way Mum's voice had comforted him during stormy nights in makeshift desert camps. He wrote of buying a silver locket for her in Cairo, of dreaming of returning home to her arms. Letter after letter revealed the man behind the pilot's license, the husband who cherished every trivial moment, who wrote love poems on stationery scavenged from military supply. Somewhere amid these declarations of devotion lay the kernel of his final promise. I carry my love for Anna in every step, he'd inscribed in his journal. But here, in these letters, I saw why. Margaret produced a final, unopened letter, dated 12th of July, 1931, 2 days before the crash. The envelope bore no smudges, as if it had never been mailed. Inside was a single folded sheet. My love, I set out tomorrow on a route you may never see. If fate turns against me, know that you were my guiding star. I will hug our child as fiercely as I hug this earth beneath my wings. Until we meet, I am yours, always. My breath caught. This letter, never sent, had lain hidden for nearly a century, a ghostly bridge between my father's heart and my mother's memory. I closed my eyes and pressed it to my chest. Feeling the weight of his final farewell, Margaret watched quietly. No one ever asked to read that letter, she said softly. Most assumed it was just another piece of memorabilia. I nodded, overwhelmed. This was more than a relic. It was the final piece of his story. I thanked Margaret and tucked the letter carefully into my pack, alongside the artifacts that had guided me through the mountains. Outside, the sun shone brilliantly, as if celebrating my discovery. I unwound the blue jacket from my shoulders and laid it across the hood of my car. With shaking fingers, I clipped the unopened letter to the jacket's breast pocket, the place where, in Dad's mind, his love for Mum had always been stored. I drove to Orange, the town where Mum had received so many of his letters. At the Redmond family cottage, I had one final task: to place this letter in Mum's old writing desk, where she'd penned her replies long ago. I parked outside and stared at the lace-curtained window where she'd sat. Inside, the desk stood solemnly by the window. I opened the top drawer, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and slid the letter inside. As I closed the drawer, I felt a profound stillness settle over me, an ending that was also a beginning. Stepping outside, I donned Dad's blue jacket one last time. The town clock chimed 3 times, its clear notes ringing in the summer air. I lifted my face to the sky, inhaling deeply. In that moment, I felt him beside me, not as a lost aviator drifting in snow, but as a father, a husband, and the man whose love had carried me through this entire odyssey. I drove back toward Bathurst, the jacket folded on the passenger seat, and let the road carry me home. The sun was dipping low when I finally returned to the Bathurst Aero Club hangar. the crisp evening air carrying the faint hum of engines winding down for the day. I carried with me not only the artifacts I'd uncovered in the high country, Dad's compass, the bent bicycle bell, the tin cup, but also the unopened letter from 12th July 1931, the one he'd never sent. As I stepped beneath the wide eaves of the hangar, its corrugated iron walls seemed to glow in the golden light, as if beckoning me to complete my father's final chapter. Peter Callahan met me at the entrance, his gait slower now that age had crept into his knees. But his eyes shone with the same quiet fire I'd seen the first day I arrived. "I thought you'd left that letter in Orange," he said with a knowing smile. I reached into my pack and produced it, the envelope's edges soft, as if pressed by 100 waiting hearts. "This belongs here," I replied, voice thick with emotion. "It's part of his story, and it needs to speak alongside the rest." He nodded and led me to the display case where, weeks earlier, we'd placed the jacket, the compass, and the photograph. Now, on a raised velvet plinth beneath protective glass, the unopened letter joined them, its presence commanding a reverent hush. Club members drifted by, pausing to read the placard. Thomas Redmond, 1892 to 1931, Letters to Home. And to wonder at the thought of words penned by a brave pilot whose final act was not one of fear, but of unbreakable love. I watched as young pilots, some barely old enough to shave, ran their fingers along the display's edge, imagining themselves in his boots, soaring above those very mountains. Mechanics challenged one another to decipher his faded cursive. An elderly volunteer tipped his hat and whispered a quiet prayer as he passed. The hangar, once a place of engines and oil, had become a sanctuary for memory and meaning. That evening, a small gathering was held in the hangar's common room. Local historians, Redmond family descendants, and members of the Snowy Mountains search party, now reduced to a handful of weathered old men whose sun-wrinkled faces still bore the wind's imprint. Together, we sat beneath strings of fairy lights, their soft glow casting gentle shadows on the corrugated walls. Margaret, the archivist from Orange, read aloud the letters Dad had written to Mum over the years. From the deserts of Egypt to the rugged coasts of Australia, each missive a testament to his devotion. When she unfolded the final, unopened letter, a hush fell so deep I could hear the flutter of a moth's wings against the iron. As she read the words, "My love, I set out tomorrow on a route you may never see. If fate turns against me, know that you were my guiding star. I will hug our child as fiercely as I hug this earth beneath my wings. Until we meet, I am yours, always." Tears pooled in many eyes, and a single collective breath seemed to bridge the decades between life and loss. After the reading, I stood to address the gathering. I wore Dad's blue jacket, its vibrant color now restored by the stories that surrounded it. The room was silent, waiting. I spoke of the mountains, their fierce beauty and their quiet cruelty, and of the echoes I'd followed, footprints in fresh snow, glimmers of a mirror under ice, the handprint in stone begging for rescue. I spoke of the people I'd met, searchers who never gave up, hangar workers who preserved his memory, archivists who protected his words, and of the final letter that had waited, unseen, until I found it. "When a story ends," I said, "it transforms into a legacy. My father's journey did not end with the crash. It continues in every pilot who dreams of flight, every child who hears of his courage, and every one of us who believes that love can transcend time and tragedy." As I finished, the room erupted in applause, gentle yet heartfelt, as though each clap was a promise never to forget. The old searchers patted my shoulder, tears and smiles mingling under the fairy lights. Peter clasped my hand, his grip firm. "You've done more than bring him home," he said softly. "You've given him a place among the stars." Later, as the hangar emptied and the lights dimmed, I lingered beside the display case, tracing the letter's envelope with my fingertip. Outside, the night sky stretched vast and unbroken, the Southern Cross brilliant against velvet black. I imagined Dad looking up at those same stars, heart full of hope. Clutching the jacket's sleeve, I made a silent vow. His story would live on beyond these walls. I would write it, speak it, and share it, so that no member of the Redmond family, no brave aviator, and no child yearning for adventure would forget that courage and love can draw us home, even from the wildest places on Earth. Turning off the lamp, I stepped into the cool night, the jacket warming my shoulders and the letter's weight resting gently against my heart. The hangar door closed behind me with a soft, determined thud, like the final beat of a story's heart, echoing into the infinite sky. The morning air was crisp and clear as I climbed into the cockpit of a restored Avro 618 Spirit of Progress replica, its polished metal fuselage gleaming in the hangar's dawn light. Today was the memorial flight, an event organized by the Bathurst Aero Club to honor pioneers of Australian aviation and, most importantly, to celebrate my father's legacy. As I settled into the pilot's seat, strapping on my headset, I felt the weight of generations pressing gently on my shoulders, carried by the steady beat of those historic radial engines. Taxiing out to the runway, I glanced across the tarmac. Beneath the wings of the Spirit of Progress lay a small gathering, club members in crisp uniforms, a handful of Redmond family descendants, and the survivors, or descendants, of the original 1931 search party. They waved as I fired up the engines, the throaty rumble echoing across the airfield. The familiar scent of oil and avgas filled my senses, and I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Dad at the controls, his hand resting on that same throttle decades ago. Clearing the runway, I pushed forward on the yoke and felt the Spirit of Progress respond, lifting gracefully into the sky. Below, the golden fields and rolling hills of Bathurst stretched out, and beyond them on the horizon, the snowy mountains stood as silent sentinels. We climbed steadily, the morning sun painting the valley in warm hues. I ran my hand over Dad's blue jacket, folded carefully and secured in the cabin behind me, its fabric worn but vibrant, a testament to a story that had been resurrected against all odds. At 5,000 feet, I throttled back to cruising power. The engines settled into a rhythmic cadence, and I transmitted my position to the Aero Club's radio. Bathurst traffic, Avro 618 replica, passing 5,000 for a commemorative flyby, with family and fellow aviators on board, honoring Captain Thomas Redmond. Below, the crowd gathered along the perimeter fence stood at attention. A lone bugler played "The Last Post," the mournful notes drifting up to meet us in the sky. I dipped the left wing in salute, the vast expanse of earth and sky uniting in a silent tribute. As we circled above the runway, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From the moment I found Dad's jacket folded on that granite slab in the snowy mountains, each relic had whispered a piece of his story, a mirror glinting beneath ice, footprints frozen in fresh snow, a handprint etched in stone pleading for rescue. Through every step I carried his words, his journal entries of hope, his letters of love, and his final promise to hold on. Descending toward the runway, I leveled out at 300 feet and flew a precise circuit, downwind, base, final, just as Dad would have in calmer times. The roar of the engines blended with the cheers from below as we passed over the threshold. When the wheels kissed the asphalt, the applause rose like thunder, and I felt a surge of emotion that caught in my throat. Taxiing back to the ramp, I brought the Spirit of Progress to a smooth stop. Mechanics rushed forward with the chocks, and I climbed down from the cockpit to embrace those who had gathered. Among them was Peter Callahan, tears shining in his eyes as he clasped my hand. "You flew him home," he said. "Thank you." Nearby, Margaret held the journal and the unopened letter, both now encased in protective sleeves. She presented them to me, and together we walked to a small ceremony area where a new plaque had been unveiled. In memory of Captain Thomas Redmond, 1892 to 1931, the first pilot of the Avro 618 Spirit of Progress, whose final flight through the snowy mountains ended in mystery until his daughter Anna brought him home. Under the plaque, the blue jacket was displayed on a framed mount, the compass resting on a velvet cushion beside it, and the unopened letter sealed in glass. I placed my hand on the jacket's shoulder, feeling the fabric's familiar texture beneath my fingertip. When the ceremony concluded, I took a moment alone beneath the statue. The Southern Cross shone overhead, and I raised my eyes to the vast Australian sky. In that boundless expanse, I believed I felt my father's presence, in the whisper of the breeze, the distant hum of wings, and the steady drumbeat of my own heart. As I walked back to the hangar, the light shifting to gold and rose, I knew the path we'd walked together, across mountains, through letters, and into the sky, had forged a legacy that would endure. The mountains would never forget his footprints, and neither would we. And with that, our story neared its close, a story of love stitched into a blue jacket, of courage carved into stone, and of a daughter's unwavering devotion soaring on wings of remembrance. The dawn, following the memorial flight, was quiet in the hangar. The Avro 618 sat at rest, its polished skin reflecting the pale light creeping through the high windows. I wrapped Dad's blue jacket around my shoulders one last time, feeling the gentle tremor of emotion in its worn fabric. Today would mark the culmination of our shared journey, his across untamed mountains, and mine through decades of unanswered questions. The Bathurst Aero Club had arranged a small gathering on the tarmac, local schoolchildren eager to hear the story of the lost pilot, veteran flyers who saw in his tale a mirror of their own dreams, and family members whose lives had been touched by his legacy. I stood before them, the jacket draped over a wooden podium, and began to speak. I recounted the first time I found that jacket folded neatly on a granite slab high in the snowy mountains, the way its elbows bore Mum's stitching, and how it guided me from ridge to hut to ravine. I told them of the mirror beneath the ice, the frozen footprints in fresh snow, the handprint begging for rescue, and the final letter penned but never sent. With each detail, eyes glistened and breaths caught. I felt my father's presence in every listener's gaze. After my speech, the Aero Club presented me with a small bronze plaque inscribed to Anna Redmond, whose unwavering devotion bridged decades and distance, reuniting a family through courage, love, and the wings of memory. I accepted it on behalf of my father, and for every pilot who had dared the skies before radio and GPS, for every searcher who braved the elements without guarantee of success, and for every child who waits at home for a loved one's return. As the ceremony concluded, I led a procession to the display case where Dad's artifacts rested. Together, we unveiled new additions: a replica of the journal's original binding, a scale model of the Spirit of Progress, and photographs of the search parties who scoured those mountains in 1931. The community's children pressed their faces to the glass, eyes wide with wonder. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the final farewell. I unhooked the jacket from its display mount and draped it gently over the shoulders of a young girl, the granddaughter of one of the original search volunteers. With her hand resting on the compass, I said, "May you carry his story forward, and may your own journeys be guided by love." She nodded solemnly, and the jacket became more than a garment. It became a symbol passed between generations. Later, as the sun dipped below the western hills, I walked alone across the tarmac. The mountain peaks I'd once climbed glowed faintly on the horizon. I took off the jacket, folded it carefully, and placed it into my pack alongside the plaque, and a small journal entry of my own. I whispered to the coming night, "Our journey is complete, but our story lives on." I lifted my eyes to the vast Australian sky, blue, boundless, and eternal. In that moment, I understood that every flight, every search, and every letter written in hope weaves together in a tapestry of human resilience. My father's path through snow and storm had led to this: a community united, a legacy reborn, and the enduring power of love to bridge any divide. With the jacket and mementos slung over my shoulder, I walked toward my car, ready to return home, but certain that wherever I went, a part of my heart would always soar among the mountains he once called both cradle and crucible.